Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learn to Love podcast, your guide to everything love, sex, intimacy, and relationships. Each week, your host, Zach Beach, interviews new experts on love, including couples therapists, relationship coaches, sex educators, and best-selling authors. Learn the best tips and cutting-edge wisdom to better love yourself, others, and the world. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, Learn to Love listeners. I'm so positively delighted that you could join us on the Learn to Love podcast. I am your host, Zach Beach, and I'm excited to introduce our guest for today's episode, Todd Baratz. Todd Baratz is a renowned psychotherapist and sex therapist based in Los Angeles and New York, whose innovative approach to mental health and relationships has established him as a leading figure in the field. He is most well known for his Instagram, Your Diagnonsense, a guide to dating, sex, and love that cuts through all the nonsense on social media to help you find more fulfilling connections. He was one of my first guests on Learn to Love podcast on an episode on Sex 101. And he came back onto the show to talk about his book, How to Love Someone Without Losing Your Mind. This episode is just slightly shorter than usual because Todd is a very busy person, so I could only have him for a limited time. But if you know his Instagram, he is a fountain of wisdom and has amazing advice that we can all immediately use to increase the quality of our relationships. So without further ado, let's begin. Hello, Todd. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, it's good to be back. It's good to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been 4 years since you were last on. So you were one of my earliest guests. I really appreciate you popping on to this little fledgling podcast that I had started. And we actually had an episode on Sex 101, which is based on a course that you were doing. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on Sex 102, or essentially, have you been thinking about anything else in this world of sex?
Yeah, I mean, I think about sex every day, all the time. I still have the course. I also added a course on love and a course on dating. So I built out a whole little subscription program with courses and sessions with me. So that's still ongoing. I can't believe it was 4 years ago. Time really flies.
Nice.
It's wild.
So what are some things your course on love teaches?
Everything. Everything from figuring out how earlier childhood trauma impacts current relationships to how to work through conflict to how to have better sex. It really runs the whole spectrum gamut of relational issues, relational skills.
Okay. And I'm sure in this world, there's a lot of love advice out there. There's a lot of quote unquote resources out there. And you created your social media, Diagnonsense, as a response to all the content that was being posted online that you felt was incorrect, potentially harmful. So what does a lot of, the so-called Insta therapy and common advice about love get wrong?
A lot of what we're seeing online in media in a variety of different places is aspirational, idealistic information about how relationships should be. Guidance, advice that's based on science fiction, really. That's based on fantasy. But a lot of information that doesn't take into account the real nuance and complexity that defines every single relationship that we're ever going to be in, from family member to friend to adult partner to random casual sex partner. The complexity, the nuance, the multi-layered experience is often left out. And instead what we get is, do this, don't do this. Your relationship should feel like this, if not leave. So there's really not a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of room for diversity and experience. And so, unfortunately, people don't fully realize that and internalize these rules or advice as values, as almost morals, to the point where if they're not measuring up, if their relationship or partner isn't measuring up, a lot of shame, a lot of anxiety tends to come up. And that creates a lot of problems.
It's true. I do find that also a lot in online sort of relationship forums and relationship advice. Sort of like black and white deal breakers. Like, I just found out my husband has been texting his and everyone's like, break up with him. He's clearly
Yeah.
cheating and lying and a deadbeat. And, once a cheater,
Yeah.
always a cheater, and different things like that. And what I'm hearing from you is that, like, relationships are a lot more complex than we might realize.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I wish that they were just this simple aspirational cell that, you could find this one person and not experience challenge or not have to probe or be curious about what's happening. But the
hmm
reality is that just doesn't exist.
So, what's an example of, maybe something that we think to be a deal breaker, or we think to be morally wrong and a reason to end a relationship, when really it's just a normal thing that happens in many relationships?
A partner who isn't constantly validating our emotions,
Mm,
differing styles of giving and receiving love, unfulfilled needs. I mean, these are vague, but oftentimes we're told that we deserve validation, we deserve to get all of our needs fulfilled, etc. And if our partner doesn't, that we
mhm,
can find somebody else because we deserve the best.
mm, mhm,
All of those, in one way or another, are framed as red flags or deal breakers for people
mm.
or relationships that they shouldn't be in.
Yeah, I'm curious your perspective on almost like transactional relationships or seeing relationships as a transaction, because a lot of people do think like, oh, if you aren't getting XYZ needs met, find somebody else. And just the idea of like finding somebody else really just feels like we come into relationships like we're buying some product. And, just as we can go through all the Amazon reviews, we can go through all the dating profiles online. And there is this basic idea that, like, if what you have isn't working, discard it and find a new one. And I'm wondering if this also ties into something you write about in your book, which is that we should essentially stop looking for the one.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's a marketplace, just like Amazon, but it's a relational marketplace. And we are on it, and our partners are on it. And we are in a state of constant evaluation. And our evaluations are usually based on our assumptions, and our assumptions are usually based on our own biases. So it's a real mindfuck and actual barrier. Yet people think that it's in service of being healthy and it's helpful and productive. But the evaluation isn't ever productive,
hmm
because it stops the development of meaning and understanding, which actually leads to better choices. When we understand something, we can make better choices. When we judge something, we're simply going off of impulse and our own unconscious bias. So it's important that people understand and get off autopilot of this kind of marketplace approach to relationships. That being a checklist of ruling in or ruling out deal breakers, green flags, red flags, and to be more present, to be more curious about getting to know people. And yes, I say stop looking for the one. There is no such thing as the perfect partner. That is also part of the evaluative approach, is that people are
hmm
looking for the perfect object. And usually that means someone that will fulfill our life, complete us, make us happy, you know, give us what we feel we lack. And that is a rescue mission. That's not partnership. So
mm
instead, we would be better served to think of the idea of partnership, a team player, someone we can share our life with, but not someone that's going to, solve our existential problems of what it means to be alive, not someone who's going to bring, perfection and bliss into our lives on an ongoing basis. That we have to understand that no matter who we pick, even if we think they're the one, we're going to experience challenge. We're going to be disappointed by them one day. They're going to frustrate us one day. We may hate them one day. We may doubt the relationship another day. So all relationships are accompanied by these challenges. And so it doesn't matter if you pick someone you think is perfect, or if you're perfect match, or if they're great on paper. It doesn't matter, because we will all choose somebody that frustrates us, that disappoints us, and that resembles some kind of our unfinished business from childhood. So to me, it's less important that we focus on the characteristics or demographics that our partners have, and more on the capacity that our potential partners or our partners have to grow, their flexibility, their self-knowledge, and how you can collaborate to co-create a relationship.
Well, I love so much of what you just said. At the beginning, you said evaluation isn't productive because it stops development of meaning and understanding. And I like how you also pointed out that in our search for the one, it's not necessary that we're just looking for like like a very good person to be in our life, but as you mentioned, the rescue mission, the person who sole responsibility is to make us happy and to bring a continuous bliss and validation in our life. So I'm wondering like what it looks like to move away from the marketplace perspective. How should we view, the early stages of relationship and getting to know someone without evaluating them? Because isn't that like a normal tendency?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm saying don't evaluate, I don't mean this in a cartoonish, blind way, like enter a situation without a care in the world. But when it comes down to it, the beginning of a relationship is a relationship basically with a stranger. So the focus has to be more on being curious about who they are, getting to know them, and letting them get to know us, and then reflecting here and there about what that experience has been like, what the dynamic is like, and if you like them. But you can't really figure out if you like somebody if you're spending your entire time with them evaluating what they're doing, or when the date ends second guessing what they did or didn't do.
Mm, mhm,
We have to humanize ourselves and the people that we're seeing and dating, if we really want to see if we can form a connection. So it is important to some extent to do some judging, to do some evaluating, but not to the extent that I think people are doing.
mhm,
And that extent is to the degree to which they are limiting how present they can be with a
mm,
partner,
mhm,
that
mhm,
it starts to interfere with the development of a connection. It starts to interfere with the capacity that we have to be vulnerable with somebody else, because stuck in an evaluative process isn't a vulnerable thing to do.
mm,
So
mhm,
it's a delicate balance. So we do have to do some evaluation. Do I like this person? Did I like that they did that? In a time limited way, not interfering or creating barriers with our capacity to be vulnerable and to use that vulnerability to connect and have a good time.
mm. I love that. Evaluation and judgment gets in the way of authentic presence. And then towards the end of your other answer, you kind of got into this idea that, the problems that we experience in a relationship aren't the sole fault of the person that we chose to be with, but are actually a reflection of our own wounding, our own challenges, our own work that needs to be done. And you write in your book that every challenge presented can be traced back to a sense of loss and an accompanying deep longing for love and acceptance, with the challenge being those we experience in relationships. So, if I'm really mad at my partner for, I don't know, I always go back to the dishes, not washing the dishes. How can those challenges that we find, how do they trace back to earlier on in my life?
Well, I mean, one, you don't necessarily need to trace absolutely everything, and not everything needs to go back to childhood. Some things we could take at face value. But for the most part, most relational dynamics, especially the ones that are unsatisfying, have some parallel, usually a reenactment from earlier childhood issues, usually our attachment relationships. So some parallel to what we experienced as kids that we then reenact and co-create a dynamic that's largely based off of those earlier experiences. And that goes for us and our partner. So you have two simultaneously occurring reenactments of earlier traumas and challenges and identities and cultural issues, clashing. And sometimes they clash in opposite ways and complementary ways, who knows. But it's important that as these issues arise, that, we are not so quick to blame our partners for 100% doing something. That if there's somebody else in the room with us, that makes it a dynamic where there is a backup and a forth, a reaction and an action. And it doesn't really matter who acted or reacted. The meaning is more in the dynamic and what the
Mm,
dynamic is rooted in. And usually the roots are from childhood, early wounds, insecurities, stuff like that.
I love the emphasis on the dynamic that two people are creating, because I feel like it takes it takes away the blame that like one person is the sole person responsible for the challenges in the relationship.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a better way.
And I know we're probably like preaching to the choir when we talk about how important love is and how amazing love is, but I'd love to just hear a little bit more about the human need and the deep human longing for love and acceptance.
Yeah, I mean, philosophers have been debating this for, centuries about what does love mean, what do we need, what, etc. Most people have some basic need to experience love. And depending on our earlier relationships, that will shape how we experience that yearning for closeness. And then that'll shape the experience of closeness and love. So that's why it's important to understand ourselves on a deeper level, to understand who we become when we seek love, who we become when we're in love, what that means to us, and what we're willing to do in those
Mm-hmm.
relationships that are loving relationships, meaning what work we're willing to put into them.
Yeah, I think that awareness is key, particularly like when we find ourselves getting activated, when we find ourselves getting angry in relationship, or even when we find like our partner yelling at us. It's easy to think that like they're pushing us away, when really underneath that anger is them just it's just a strategy for them to get the love and acceptance that they want. So your book is on how to not lose our mind in our relationships, and I'd love to hear about why people do feel like they're losing their mind in relationships. As you've already kind of talked about, we easily and often get our buttons pushed, and often buttons we didn't even know that we had. And suddenly, this person that we said that we loved, we are yelling at, we are getting quite reactive to and frustrated with. Why do we sometimes feel like we're losing our mind with this person that we love?
Everyone's going to lose their shit. Everyone's going to lose their mind in a relationship that is deep, intimate, loving, sexual, etc. It is going to stir up large emotions. And in the experience of a powerful emotion, it can often feel like we're about to lose our mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes there's part of us that can see that, okay, this isn't that big of a deal, but it feels like the end of the world. There are other times where we can become so reactive, where things can feel so urgent, where we can feel disappointed to an extent that makes us feel like we could die, that it needs to be
Mm-hmm.
fixed when it's really like not that big of a deal. Our partner could not text us in a certain way, and we could have anxiety. Why are they texting me? What is happening? So when we feel connected to somebody in a deeper way, when there's emotional intimacy, these relationships start to resemble attachment relationships. Our partners, our adult partners, tend to play a very central role in our lives. They can often play the most important role in our lives. And because of that, the risk in these relationships increase. And the longer we're with somebody, the higher the risk becomes, because there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot to lose. And so lose meaning pain, suffering. And so in those contexts, all of our defenses come up at play. Again, we do these reenactments, our wounds get triggered, all sorts of outlandish feelings come up that we don't feel with other people. So it can be a real place of intensity. And it's in that intensity that creates that sense of, oh my God, I'm going to absolutely lose my mind. I can't deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll be different for everybody, and different partnerships are going to bring up different things. But this is what I was saying about the aspirational content in media in general, is that it really doesn't include this experience, the experience of having to manage having or being triggered, being disappointed chronically. That's not to say
Mm-hmm.
that you should settle for chronic disappointment or chronic anything in a relationship, but there are things that we have to tolerate in relationships, and sometimes those things are really hard and will stir up our earlier issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a whole tornado of feeling, of dynamics, of challenge.
I love that. It reminds me of a very silly situation that happened recently where I was texting my wife and she was like on her way home and she was like not at home the time that she was supposed to. And I was like, she's dead. She got in a car accident and she's dead. My mind just like created like all these scenarios, and to a certain extent our Panic or losing our mind is reflective of the connection and specialness that we feel in the relationship and that we don't want to lose it. And you mentioned this word trigger, and I'd love to get a little bit more into that because we do find ourselves getting triggered in relationships. And I'm wondering what a trigger is to you, especially because in this insta therapy world, I feel like people use it a lot, especially in like politics. People are like, oh, you're just triggered that, this is happening. How do we delineate a trigger between an appropriate emotional response?
Yeah, I mean the word triggered is used a lot. Some people don't like it. I actually don't mind it. I use it a lot in my book. I think it's a great word to describe what happens. Some people say activated. Some you can say overwhelmed. You can come up with your own words, but basically what it means is that something in the here and now in your environment is triggering, activating, etc., a level of intensity inside your body that is deeply rooted in something earlier. We can think of it as an unconscious memory of that something earlier stuff, but that's what it is. And what was the second part of the question?
Almost a scenario I'm imagining is, let's just go back to like one partner finding out the other person is texting their ex. And let's say the texter is like, gosh, you are so triggered right now. And the person's like, I think this is an appropriate emotional response to have in this situation. I guess for me, I feel like a trigger points to something you need to work on because it's beyond what the situation warrants. But how do we delineate between a very valid emotional response and a trigger that reflects our own stuff?
Well, yeah, this is the ultimate question. People are like, well, is it me or is it my partner? This kind of binary, and it's both.
Hmm.
It's both what's happening in the current dynamic in your relationship. It's both what your partner said or did, and what it brings up for you.
Hmm. Hmm.
The texting of the ex, did they just wish them a happy birthday or are they sexting them? There's a lot of questions that I would need to know before using an example. But if they're just saying happy birthday or hope you're doing well, whatever, and then you have a panic attack because of that, we have to think about, okay, well, what's happening here?
Hmm. Hmm.
What is it coming up? Are you feeling betrayed or, what were you cheated on before?
Mm.
What is the insecurity and the jealousy that's arising? That's not to say that we should be thrilled our partner is wishing their ex a happy birthday or something like that. But it is to say that, it's probably something innocent and our partners can be in touch with their exes without that having implications about their feelings about their exes. But, when we have these large, powerful emotional responses, we cannot place the blame on our current environment to shoulder the responsibility for all of that largeness.
Mm.
It wouldn't even be accurate.
I love that.
Triggers are always stuff for us to take responsibility for. That's not to give a pass to whatever's happening in our environment, but it is just to say that we have to take responsibility for the role that we play in the triggers that come up and what we do in response to the feelings that the triggers arise.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. I feel like this is a lovely segue into how not to lose our mind. What I'm hearing is awareness. What I'm hearing is being able to take a step back and reflect on what's really happening with us and where it might be coming from. But I'll ask the therapist here, how do I not lose my mind with this person I love and cherish and care so deeply about, and then have really challenging emotions and triggers and stuff coming up?
Well, you will lose your mind. The title of my book, How to Love Someone Without Losing Your Mind, is a bit of a bait and switch.
Dang.
Uh, yeah, but it's so easy, whether it's relationships or just life in general, to buy into this system of pain avoidance, this cultural value of avoidance of challenge, the value of if I do X, Y, Z, then my life will be free of challenge. And the way that our relationship with challenge, our relationship to conflict, to pain, is the problem. So we have to all change our relationship, our responses, how we manage pain, suffering, and challenge. Because that's really what creates suffering, is when we experience challenge and we think we shouldn't, or we blame other people, or we let our insecurities take the wheel. If you want to accept yourself, the best thing to do is to accept that you're imperfect, that you're limited, that your partner is imperfect and limited, that life is imperfect and limited, that everything ends, that everything is full of risk, and to be able to develop a level of comfort and tolerance with all of that, which, is fucking hard. And because that's really scary. Who wants to do that? I want answers. I want to know where this is going. I want to know what's right and what's wrong. But the reality is that that's not really how life or relationships work. So if you really want to focus on being able to stay calm, and not feel out of control, which is, somewhat impossible depending on where you live, that's about accepting the ebbs and flows, the ruptures and repair that happen in all relationships.
I love that. Pain is not the problem. Our relationship with pain is the problem. And what I'm always hearing from you is that we can lose our mind, but we can find it again. Or basically, like, we will experience triggers, disruption, disconnection, and that's normal in relationships. So what we do need to work on and manage is de-escalation, repair, reconnection, and cultivating a level of awareness so that we've gained a certain insight when that trigger happens so that we can lessen its effect in the future. Another idea in your book I'd love to talk about as we're kind of winding down is what it means to become rather than find ourselves.
I think this is a word choice thing, and I chose become rather than find just because become feels like an ongoing process, whereas find feels like take a bath and do some deep breathing and you find yourself. It feels too easy to me. Become, to me, is more about a complicated process that's ongoing and forever to me. Because I think people often invest in this idea that if they read this book or if they do this journal or whatever, that they'll become so self-aware and know themselves and, find themselves, period, and be done. But the reality is that becoming ourselves, developing self-awareness is something that happens until we die. It's something that happens throughout our lives. And even at the end, we can't fully know ourselves. A quote I have in the book, I think it's Sharon Salzberg quote, but she says, we can only know ourselves as much as an expert swimmer can know the entire ocean. Basically saying that, we can know ourselves a lot, but the depth and the distance of everything that we are is simply not something we can fully know.
I love that. Thinking of life as a practice, as a journey. I'll just challenge you a little bit because aren't I already myself?
Yeah, you are yourself, but you're also becoming more of yourself. You're also learning more things about yourself every day.
I wouldn't mind getting a little personal as we're closing down. Just because you're a therapist, I'm actually in therapy school right now, so I'm
Cool.
entering into my second year, yes.
That's awesome.
And, I'm almost imagining people having some trepidation into seeing a therapist or the couple who says that they don't need a therapist. And you write a little story in your book about how your therapist, Derek, and your book is actually dedicated to Derek, how he saved your life.
Yeah, I started therapy at a very young age, at a time where I was going through a horrible emotional time and, drugs, hurting myself, all of this shit. And he did quite literally save my life. I still see him today. I've been seeing him for over 20 years, see him every week. He's been there for me throughout my whole life. That's why I became a therapist, is the transformative experience I had with him in therapy. Therapy has had one of the biggest impacts on my life ever.
Wow. And I'm wondering if this does tie into what you mentioned earlier about being able to kind of meet pain and challenges. Because I feel like a lot of people, we do have all sorts of avoidance strategies, even psychological complexes like denial. And I do feel like a lot of people use all sorts of things to avoid the necessary work, whether it's, drugs, alcohol, or eating or overworking, different ways that we do avoid pain. And what kind of courage it does take to go into the therapy office and just be with the difficulty for an hour.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do, but it's actually, to me, harder not to do it. It's harder not to face some of these things. It's harder not to do this work.
I love that. Yeah, it ties so much into we're here to finish our business, and your relationship is going to be much harder if we don't work through these things. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your valuable day, Dot, for coming onto the show. But I do have to finish by asking the question I ask all of my guests, which is, What do you wish everyone knew about love?
My
I see
dog
the
has a
dog
lot to
has
say
a.
about that. I want people to be more curious about themselves, more curious about their partners, more curious in general. Ask more questions, reflect more, think more, process more, engage more.
I love it. I do also think curiosity is such a crucial part of love. And it's also open, right? It opens us up.
It expands the possibility.
So Todd Baratz, the author of How to Love Someone Without Losing Your Mind. For our listeners who want to learn more about you, how can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram at YourDiagNonsense or my website, toddbaratz.com.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a lovely conversation, Todd. You're doing amazing work in the world. And yeah, it's wonderful to reconnect with you after so many years. So I look forward to seeing you again with your next book. You've lost your mind, but it's okay. You can find it again.
That's a good idea.
So thanks again, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It was good to see you. I enjoyed our chat.
Wow, what an incredible interview. Thanks, Todd, for coming on, and thank you, listeners, for listening to the show. I hope you remember all of the valuable lessons that Todd shared with us today, including we are constantly fed aspirational and idealistic information about how relationships should be, when in reality, all relationships are complex, nuanced, and diverse. Evaluation and judgment isn't productive because it stops the development of meaning and understanding in relationships and gets in the way of authentic presence. Relationships are not about what each person is doing, but the co-created dynamic between them, the action and the reaction. And guess what? We are all going to lose our minds at certain times in relationships, and these times are ripe opportunities to gain awareness of our triggers and emotional patterning. Pain is not the problem. Our relationship to pain is the problem. So remain curious. When you find yourself reactive, remain curious about what is going on inside of you, and remain curious and open to your partner and learning about their vast and limitless world. And remember, you are perfect just the way you are. You are lovable, loving, and loved.
Thanks again for listening to the Learn to Love podcast. To learn more about the show and your host, head over to zachbeach.com or theheartcenter.com. You can also follow Zach on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.